Hi, everyone. I apologize for the late start. Are we ready to go, everyone? Yeah? All right, we've been having some technical difficulties. Hopefully we'll be able to make it work. We're having some issues with the images, but hopefully we'll be able to show you some images. But before we get going, I wanted to welcome everybody to our discussion on media representation, to thank the organizers of this event. My name is Catherine Zuromskis. I'm an associate professor of photography and visual culture at Rochester Institute of Technology. And I also have helping me out today two other RIT faculty, Mary Jaye Blanchard, who's an independent animator and assistant professor of animation in the School of Film and Animation. And she's going to be facilitating the chat. And Mark Reisch, who is a 3D animator, also an assistant professor in the School of Film and Animation, and he's going to be handling our images. I also want to briefly introduce the members of our panel. First, we have Aria A. She is a 2D puppet animator and commercial illustrator, currently working on her BFA, 2 BFA degrees from RIT. Joy Anderson. Joy is an animator and illustrator from Washington, D.C., and she is currently in her 3rd year at RIT, where she's pursuing a BFA from the School of Film and Animation. We have Wáats'asdiyei, who is Haida from Craig, Alaska, and who has won multiple awards for his films across the globe. And he's currently working as a writer for the PBS Kids show, Molly of Denali. And finally, we have Rebecca Posadas Nava. She is a 4th year student at RIT pursuing a BFA in photojournalism and a BS in photographic sciences. So we would like this discussion today to be as kind of organic and inclusive as possible. So I want to start by kind of talking a little bit with the panel, but we encourage you to ask questions and engage and respond to some of the stuff we'll be talking about. So if you do have a question, we've got a lot of you here. I can't see you all on the screen. So I've got Mary Jaye who's going to be helping out. Please feel free to raise your hand using the raise hand feature in Zoom, or type a question into the chat, and then MJ will let me know that someone has a question, and then you can either type the whole question into the chat, or I'll kick it over to you and you can unmute yourself and ask the panelists. Okay, so we asked panelists and some of the faculty who worked on organizing this panel to submit some images for discussion, because this is a panel that is about representation in the media, and hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about this idea of representation from the point of view of the maker, but also from the point of view of the audience. So I wanted to start by showing a few of the images that our panelists submitted, and getting some of the panelists to talk a little bit about why these chose these images, how it relates to the theme of the workshop, and stuff like that. So Mark, are we ready to do the screen share?
Yep.
Can we pull up
Here we go.
First image?
Hopefully you should be seeing an image.
It just says that you, oh, there we go. All right, so here's our first image, and maybe this would be something that Wáats'asdiyei might want to talk a little bit about, since this is a project he's involved in.
I believe Mark says some wonderful words. If he can start off, and then I can go off of what he says, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I was the one that, we were told to find some images that we thought would be a good point of discussion, and so I just started putting images in, and so I didn't realize that Wáats'asdiyei was a part of this film, or TV show. But essentially, I well, our family tries to show shows that have more diversity, or if we are watching a show, we point out when representation isn't happening on those shows and kind of talk about why, or what the problem is with that. But we ended up coming and finding this show, Molly of Denali, and if you don't know, it's a little girl who lives in Alaska, and she is indigenous to Alaska, and so it has, it's both educational and a fun kind of story. So, and it's definitely, a culture that you don't, or that at least, here in the United States, we don't really take a look at it and know a lot of. And so, it was a good, a good show to watch. And so then I found out that Wáats'asdiyei worked on it. So I was pretty excited.
Yeah, being a writer for this project is pretty surreal. As an Alaska Native, I'm very honored to work on a project like Molly Denali. Molly Denali is the first lead character to be on the show nationwide. It's also playing all over Canada as well. And it's pretty great. Just a little backstory. I have a daughter, who's 2 years old, and she gets to watch someone like her on national TV now. The closest thing I had to was like the people I had to look up to was like Rocky, and people like that were who were kind of like the father figures for myself. But now she gets to see someone like her being responsible, doesn't have that stereotype of, and it's pretty crazy. Of the studies that we did in PBS was that 20% of Americans didn't believe or didn't know that natives are still around. And yes, we are here. We do everything that everybody else does. I mean, like we have our cup of coffee in the morning. We use our iPads for Zoom meetings, just like anybody else. And we're trying to have that communication with everybody else that, we're here, we're just like you, and, we're not all bad.
I will also add one other thing that was nice too, is it also incorporates some of the language too. So like you learn, some of the daily words that they use, which is pretty cool.
Thanks very much. One of the things that I think is important to talk about, and we don't necessarily need to talk about it right this second in this case, but I'm interested in thinking about who is making the work and how, I think part of what's important about Molly of Denali is the representation, but also where that representation is coming from, like whose perspective it is speaking from. And kind of dealing with this question of who makes images about whom. I wonder if maybe we could, do you mind, kind of related to this is the image that Joy submitted. Mark, can you pull up the Shira image?
And can I just say, while Mark, you're pulling up that image, we have a question about the chosen name of Molly. Can we ask that question from one of the
Sure.
audience members? So this person is saying, curious as the chosen name of Molly. Molly is an indigenous person, and that is not a typical name. Can you speak to the name of the show?
Yeah, I'm not able to. I'm not the creative producer of the show, but a lot of people here in Alaska, a lot of natives, like my English name is Joe. I go by Wáats'asdiyei, but we do have English names as well. So, and there's a new wave where like my daughter's name is Nayakuk. That's not a traditional English name, but it's a fun way of knowing Denali, or a lot of people say Denali. A lot of people in the very beginning wanted Sally at Denali. So it's just kind of the fun PBS way of rhyming and kid friendly. But yes, we us natives do have English names as well. It would have been great, you know, to. But yeah, kind of like what Mark said, though, there's a lot of Alaska Native language within the episode representation there. And most writers are Alaska Native.
Thanks. So I think we have this, the image that Joy put in pulled up. So maybe Joy, would you mind talking for a moment or two about the kind of backstory to what we're looking at here?
Yeah, sure. So She-Ra and the Princesses of Power is a reboot that aired on Netflix of the 80s She-Ra cartoon. And it was praised a lot for its like, great representation and diversity across like all sort of barriers. Like it had a lot of representation for people of color, LGBT people, and like disability representation. And so it's a really important show for a lot of people. However, there was some controversy recently because there was a live stream with the writers, and all of the writers that were on the live stream were white, and an inside joke was mentioned of one of the main characters' name is Bo, and he's a black man, and someone made a joke referencing Bo having a brother named So, who worked in the fields and all that, and a lot of people were uncomfortable with that joke because it was very similar to like an imagery of slaves, and it sort of wasn't really funny to have a powerful main character have a brother who was basically a slave. And so the creator of the show like tweeted out like this image that they were referencing, and it didn't really make it better because it still was an offensive image. And it was really disappointing to see that behind the scenes of this really important show that highlighted diversity were white people making pretty racist inside jokes with each other and didn't really realize that they were racist. And so I think it's a great example of why we not only need diversity in, shows, but we also need diversity in writers' rooms as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think, this is a really interesting case of, something that is, it's about the representation, but it is also about, the identity of the people in the writers' rooms and the choices they're making as a group, and how they are choosing to represent, this Black character and the kind of context for it.
Can I, just to speak to that, somebody in the chat has a comment about, this is coming from Amberine, in the process of saying that we are like you, in terms of diverse writers having to look at themselves through the lens of what is more the norm, I wonder if there is a pressure. My characters do not drink coffee every morning. And so maybe even Amberine, would you want to speak more on that point, or just, what you're saying when you're talking about, and then somebody follows that up by saying, we are just like you, is that diversity?
Thank you, MJ. I just wrote that because that's what I struggle with a lot of times, because I'm writing from my experience of being a brown woman who's new to this country. And when I create my characters who are being read by people who are not like me, the expectation that the characters should immediately make sense and be accessible, like I feel that gap really sometimes makes me wonder if in the process of this meaning making we are really sort of covering up some of the more insightful values that our characters can uncover for the reader or the audience. But because we are trying to be like them, then I just wonder where does it take to? I really stick to the idea that my characters are, even if you don't understand them, even if they're not easily accessible to you, you have to do the work of understanding them rather than me simplifying them for you. So it was just in sort of a comment, but thank you for giving me the time to speak. Thanks so much.
Okay, this was actually, Mark, can you, this is not the image, it's the let Black characters stay human image. Sorry, we're supposed to have a PowerPoint and it isn't working for some reason, so we're having to pull up images in a less sophisticated well,
Mark, oh, yeah,
there we go.
yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. So here's this is the
Sorry,
final
I thought
image.
you were all seeing that.
It's okay. This is the final image that one of our panelists submitted. Aria, do you want to talk a little bit about this image?
I would love to. Good afternoon, everyone. So I chose this image because to put it into perspective, if we're talking about African American representation in general, there hasn't been a lot in terms of the beginnings of American animation up until now. In the process of trying to get more representation in the media, there has been this disturbing trend among characters that are African American being put in the limelight. For example, The Princess and the Frog came out in 2008, and for most of the movie, she is a frog. to put it blankly, 62% of the movie she is a frog. And Spies in Disguise came out not too long ago, and 45% of the movie he is a pigeon. And you know, a lot of people, when I talk about this, or when other people, you know, especially African Americans, talk about this very common trend where an African American is put at the center of a movie or a TV, well, more so movies, but put at the center when they usually aren't. People always say, oh, well, Aria, you know, there's a common trend in animation where, you know, characters turn into something else. And, you know, that happens all the time. We really shouldn't think too much about it. But I want you to imagine something. Imagine waiting 70 years for somebody from your favorite animation production company, your favorite studio, to make a character that looks like you. 70 years. And then for most of the movie, she's a frog. I think it would be safe to assume that that would be very disappointing. You know, at the time, you know, you being a child or however old you are, you're like, wow, you know, representation, oh my gosh, we've made it. And this is amazing. But then you really start to think about that, like this movie comes out and then another movie where the same thing happens. And it's really, it's not good. It's very not good. And I feel like because there is so much, because we haven't had a lot of representation, if you like facts, there's only been 29 instances in American animation where a African American character is put at the front as a main character in a leading role, in a positive role. 23 of them are TV shows, and only 6 of them are currently on air. And 6 movies in the entirety of American animation have had African Americans as the forefront, as characters that are at the forefront. So which is not good, honestly. And that's really what it comes down to when it comes down to representation in media. We need to have we need to have writers' rooms, as Joy was saying. We need to have more diversity in writers' rooms. We need to have more people in these rooms that aren't just like, you know what, well, we're going to make a character that isn't a part of the normal demographic that we show, but they don't do the research. And that also is the big thing. I feel like a lot of times when people run into pitfalls where there are instances where, you know, something comes off as offensive or wrong, it's because people don't do the research. They don't have enough people in the room that are from that demographic, or listening to people that are from that demographic that are able to actually, you know, have insight and say, you know, maybe we shouldn't post that. Maybe we shouldn't make a story that's like this. Maybe we should make a story that's like this. And so I think that really comes down to making these writings rooms, making more diversity, and having Hollywood actually look and be like, oh, well, you know, we can make stories where characters from different backgrounds that aren't white are at the forefront and people will still enjoy it. So.
Aria, you might have, you might have just answered this question, but we have a question from the audience saying, would Into the Spider-Verse be a better representation?
Yes, yes, actually. Into the Spider-Verse, and there is a show currently on Cartoon Network called Craig of the Creek. Those are both beautiful examples where it's representation, where the character is able to embrace not only their culture, who they are, but they're able to head a story where it's not just that, oh, you know, the story is completely centered around, yes, where the story is not completely centered around who they are as a person, like them being Black, or is in case he's half Black, half Hispanic, if I'm correct. And it's not just that he is Spider-Man. He, you know, he can do everything Spider-Man can do and more. And throughout the story, you know, it's not a hindrance. He doesn't turn into a spider. He is Spider-Man. He gets to be with the big dogs. It's honestly a beautiful way of showing representation in a positive way, where the character can be in roles like mostly white characters have been, and hold their own, and people can relate to it and can enjoy it as well.
We have two more questions, actually. So the first question is going to be coming from Vanessa Sweet.
I think maybe it's a little bit less of a question, as just furthering the conversation. I don't remember who I was talking to recently, so if you're in this panel, please speak up. But we were discussing representation in media and avoiding this storytelling of trauma. Like why do Black folks, Indigenous folks, always have to rely on, when they tell a story, we have to always talk about trauma, and moving away from that. You know, and while trauma is 100%, you know, a valid, important thing to discuss and to bring light to, but, you know, that kind of trap that happens when we start telling stories, where what are the acceptable stories that are being told in like in our society now. And so I just was wondering your takes on that, you know, versus, especially in light of, you know, you bring up 62% with Princess and the Frog, you know, there's, oh, we're going to be an owl now, we're going to be a frog now. But also when we are not doing that, there's films like Liana, which is a very, very fascinating film that's a documentary of young boys in Africa, well, girls and boys in Africa who had suffered through trauma, and how they use their storytelling to move beyond that, which is also a valid and good story. But how come those are being the only things that are acceptable to view?
And I want to jump in here for 1 second, because we have one other panelist that hasn't had a chance to speak.
Yeah,
and so I just, go ahead.
Yeah, I did want to just, I was wondering actually, because I think it's interesting that we're looking at a lot of animated images. So these are fictions that are kind of completely constructed from the ground up. But I wanted to bring in photography, because I think a lot of people who kind of involved in putting this together are photographers. And Rebecca, we don't have an image from you, but if you don't mind, maybe we could go back to the Jonathan Bachman image, because, you know, kind of talking about positive and negative stereotypes, like part of what V is talking about is about the way that our culture kind of patterns these stories and these ideas about different kind of cultural and ethnic groups and racial groups, and kind of moving away from those can be a struggle. I mean, it's sort of imprinted in all of our brains. It's all around us all the time. That's part of what's so difficult and insidious about stereotypes. And I actually pulled this image because I think it's an incredible image of something that is dealing on some level with trauma and the Black experience in America. But I think the way that this photograph is shot really kind of challenges the conventions that a lot of photographers have had ingrained into their way of looking at things, just because we're so surrounded with a certain kind of representation. So I don't know if, Rebecca, I could encourage you to chime in at all about your experience as a photojournalism student. You don't necessarily need to talk about this image. I don't mean to put you on the spot with this, but I just wanted to bring photography into the conversation.
No worries, I'm familiar with the image. And I just wanted to address or go back to sort of the conversation about retelling traumatic stories. And I think for me, and this is kind of a good example of that for sure, as you had mentioned, for minority groups and oppressed groups. So I'm Mexican and I'm an immigrant, obviously. When stories of trauma are told to you over and over again, where the person that you identify doesn't have power, then that in itself becomes traumatic because you don't know how else to break that cycle. So this image is exciting in that sense, and it was actually taken, the photographer's name is Jonathan Bachman. He's not Black. I'm not entirely sure what his ethnicity is, but I think that's important to take into consideration, because when we talk about representation, we also have to think about who can tell the stories of whom, which we touched upon. And so that's just something to keep in mind when this image is looked at. But what's powerful about the image is that even though Laisha, who's in the image, the woman to the right, is going through something traumatic, which is being arrested, she's doing it out of her own free will, and her head is held high. And that's why, even though this image is about trauma, it's surpassing trauma, and it's almost even about healing trauma, because she's able to stand up to these people who represent a lot of traumatic things for her community.
Yeah, and I mean, she's not a victim here.
No.
If we can put it that way, right?
Yeah, she's there because she wants to.
There's I don't mean to interrupt anyone in terms of, I'm trying to read the questions that are being asked, but I'm going to put this question to you, Rebecca. This is coming from Isabella, and she's asking, when people tell you about white erasure in the media, how do you respond? People often come at me with the argument that there is an overemphasis on diversity in the media. Where's the line between equality with diversity and minority domination?
Okay.
Could I answer? Oh, go
ahead.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I definitely do not think that there's white erasure. I definitely think there is, more of a focus on diversity, but in my opinion, it's not nearly enough of a focus on diversity, because a lot of diversity I've noticed has been very performative, and coming from a place of wanting to please an audience rather than giving actual diversity, because there's been so many stories about Black trauma, and a lot of the representation I've had in my life from Black stories has just been about trauma, whether it be like slavery or being the help, or even being like the side character, the friend that helps with everything but never has her own story. like a lot of the representation that I've had as a Black woman has just been just traumatic, and it does a lot to like your mental health. A lot of people don't realize it, but like having like movies and TV shows just about like the trauma of people who look like you is not great. And so I think the focus on, you know, having more stories about Black people experiencing joy is really important. And I think some people may be threatened by that because they're not used to not having their story told. So I just think it's important to put, you know, the feelings of the people you're making something for over people who already have had their story told a million times.
I'd also like to jump in on that. I do not believe that there is such a thing as minority domination. The reason why a lot of white people are upset or shocked or feel like there's so much diversity than there has been in recent times, especially within the media, is because we as African Americans and as other minority groups have not had a seat at the table. It's been about 50 years since we have been able to even sit in the same place as white Americans, has been able to be with white Americans and not feel like you are impositioned or that you might die or that there might be something horrific that will happen to you if you even talk to someone and that is not of your certain demographic. And I think if somebody comes up to you and says, you know, I feel like there's a lot of diversity nowadays and there's a lot of, you know, white erasure, it does not exist. White erasure does not exist. The reason why it just seems like it's so much right now is because there has been no avenues, no spaces where people of color have been able to express themselves, be in these industries, be able to put out these stories, be able to talk essentially without repercussions. So.
Can I also just kind of jump in there? I see that as Bella's asking about, you know, how do you explain that to him? Well, I think one of the ways that you can explain that to him is to tell him, just take a look at what's on TV, you know, and count the number of, you know, BIPOC characters or versus white characters or white-led TV shows and movies. And, you know, there is a great disparity between those two. And, you know, films like, you know, Spider-Man, the Spider-Verse, which got a lot of initial kickback from the general audience that was just freaking out that there was going to be a Black Spider-Man. But then the film came out and it was just amazing. And there was a lot of kickback about Black Panther being, you know, a main movie. But again, that turned out to be an amazing story, both not dealing specifically with, you know, the historical trauma, but telling stories with Black characters that were, you know, fantastic stories in and of themselves.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I loved, Aria, the way you gave us like numbers. I think part of the reason that this conversation can be so difficult is that people kind of resort to feelings. And so white people feel like they're being discriminated against when more opportunities are being given to people of color, when in fact, white people have always had this, you know, massive advantage on their side, and so evening it out feels like discrimination, but it's not, and the numbers show us that it's not, right? I think at this point we're technically almost out of time, but since we got started late, I'm hoping they'll let us run over by, you know, 5 to 7 minutes maybe. I'd love to just open it up to kind of questions or points of conversation from anyone, panelists, audience.
Actually, Wáats'asdiyei has a question, and Wáats'asdiyei, I can let you ask your own question if you want. You've typed it, but you can ask
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, so I just saw on the news, I believe yesterday, that the new Academy Awards nominations will require a certain amount of diversity roles. And I was wondering what you guys think about that and how that's going to be changing what we see on TV from here on out.
I'm hopeful about it because I think, you know, having more people of color and especially Black people in not only, you know, leading roles, but also writing and directing, I think that would be game changing for the industry because it still very much is a white led industry. Even with stories about Black people and like Black culture and other POC cultures, there's most of the writers are white. Like I remember when I saw Moana, I was like, wow, they put so much effort into this. It seemed like they loved this culture so much. And then one of the directors was white, I think, and I was just like confused because it was such an important movie to so many people. I think the same thing happens with like a lot of other movies where, you know, they're telling a story of someone who is a person of color and the culture is integral to the plot, yet the writers and the directors are white. And so I think it would be so much more authentic and so much more powerful if the diversity translates to writers and directors, and requiring that is one step in the right direction. But, you know, I have seen pushback against it. And I just hope that people don't, you know, that executives don't complain about it, you know, too much.
Oh, Mark just pulled up a really great example of something that in which the people making the show are, you know, representing, you know, the culture that is being depicted on screen. I'm not sure who pulled this image. Mark, was this you?
So this is one that I pulled. So this is a show currently on Netflix, and if you haven't seen it and you have Netflix, watch it tonight. It's fantastic. It's essentially
It's called Pose.
It's called Pose, and the director is Janet Mock, and it's the first openly transgender female director to, you know, have basically their own film, our own TV show to create. So this is set in the 80s with the ballroom culture of the gay, transgender, the LGBT community, and, you know, where voguing came from. And so it basically goes through, you know, when AIDS started coming around. And so this is one of those shows that does have the trauma, but it also, you know, is very educational as to, you know, how, you know, how people have arrived at these, you know, where we are today is kind of like a little history lesson. So I highly recommend it. I can't highly recommend it enough.
Hi, everyone. So I've just gotten a message from the organizers of the event saying that we need to close this up as soon as possible so that we can let the next panel in. So I don't know if there are any final quick comments before we go. I know this feels way too short. I guess we sort of knew that coming in, and I apologize again for the technical difficulties that made it even shorter than it should have been. But does anyone have any final thoughts?
Hey, Catherine, this is Kevin. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Levine Center, Tanhane, along with Carolyn Nussbaum. And I want you to know that throughout the year, we're looking to take these type of programs and present them again with even more time. So kind of think of today as a buffet that definitely feels short because there's much we can, particularly the subject matter. And I have some real strong experiences and feelings around this because I think images matter. And, you know, we're in the town of Frederick Douglass, and he saw the importance of images and to counter the balance the images that were being portrayed of African Americans. So we'll have another opportunity to have this and maybe a longer discussion around it. So I just want to thank you guys for what you did today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And thank you for the work that you're doing. You're doing a great job. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, well, with that, I just want to thank our panelists, Rebecca, Aria, Joy, and Wáats'asdiyei. Thank you so much for making time to have this conversation and for your eloquent words. And thank you to everyone who showed up for this. Hopefully, we will have opportunities to continue this discussion in the future. So thanks, everyone.